You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 446 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the U.S. continuing its regime change effort in Venezuela and Glenn Greenwald being targeted by the Brazilian government. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. The show is growing, and a lot of that is because people are getting out there, clicking the share button, or telling other people to tune in. I've gotten emails recently saying, hey, started listening to the show recently. I really like it. So that means when you do share it, people appreciate it. So keep it up, everyone. You find the show online at the Libertarian Institute. I'm the news editor at the Libertarian Institute. I write the daily news roundup. The show itself is also featured on the homepage of the site. That also means that the show is on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. So if you want my show along with Free Man Beyond the Wall by Pete Quinones and Scott Horton's show, Bill Gibson's show is featured there as well. So we'll have great content. Or you could subscribe to the show somewhere else. It's on all of its own podcast feeds. And no matter where you subscribe to the show, be sure to give it a rating and review. If you want to donate to the show, you can do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so recently we have Mike Pompeo making some statements that the U.S. is still committed to the regime change effort led by Juan Guaido in Venezuela. Now, this is important because, it can seem like, well, Kyle, you've been talking about this for almost a year now. Guaido's been claiming that he's the president of the country, and the U.S. has been supporting that. Why is it significant that Mike Pompeo is saying it now? Well, Juan Guaido has actually lost his seat as the head of a parliament that gave him the position to declare himself president by his distorted version of the Venezuelan constitution. So, kind of logically following this very illogical situation, if he then loses that post, he should probably lose the presidency. And then, if you want to continue the regime change effort, maybe you have to pick up with the guy who is now in that position. But anyways, it seems the U.S. is still backing Juan Guaido. It's a really crazy thing going on there where Maduro is in full control of the state, and the military, the bureaucracy. It's a socialist state, so, he has a lot of control. The oil company, that's all under the authority of the Maduro government. And yet you have this guy who has international support from 50-something countries, I believe, running around Venezuela for the most part a free man. Now, I'm not saying that the Venezuelan government hasn't abused him and I think at times detained him. But at the same time, he, hasn't been thrown in a Guantanamo Bay-like facility and not charged with anything and disappeared for years on end. Probably like what might happen to an American if, let's say, they had the backing of the Russian government and declare themselves president. Either that or a mental institution. But it seems to me that Guaido is being allowed to run around Venezuela with all this support from the international government, but really no real control within Venezuela at all. And that's the movement that the U.S. is continuing to back. So it's quite crazy, I guess, when you actually look at the situation and realize that this, it's not like 3 or 4 weeks. We're talking 10 months down the road. Now, there are real consequences to this. It's not, because it does sound kind of comical that the U.S. would just bat some random guy in Venezuela. But the U.S. is backing some random guy in Venezuela. And then they're on top of that saying, if you don't make this person president, we will sanction your country, and has continued to sanction the Maduro government for, repression of the people and all that, but basically trying to, sanction a regime change effort into place. And it's not even clear that that's the will of the Venezuelan people. And so, I'm not a slave to democracy, but at the same time, since, democracy seems to be the way that, or the basis of the moral basis of the U.S. empire, we're not even remotely following that in Venezuela. So the U.S. has heavily sanctioned the country. This has hurt the civilians. Again, the country's in poverty in part because of the ineptitude of the communist government, or I should say socialist government. But now, on top of that, massive U.S. sanctions regime, not exporting as much oil, probably getting trouble getting imports in. There's been cases of the U.S. seizing ships going to Venezuela that contain food product. So we're contributing to this, and Venezuelans are starving, and there's been some studies that claim that the U.S. contributed to the death of 40,000 Venezuelans. While I'm not saying that, the 40,000 number, sounds right, it does seem like it's clear that the U.S. is contributing to the death of Venezuelans, and, with enough significant sanctions, I mean, we saw the 500,000 number was maybe a little bit of inflation for what happened in Iraq, but hundreds of thousands of children starved to death. The most recent round of sanctions is 15 planes owned by the Venezuelan state oil company. Now, I don't think that sanctioning 15 planes is going to have much of an impact on a country of millions and, tens of thousands of starving children. However, I think it is a signal that the U.S. really does continue to support the Guaido government. I mean, Guaido losing a seat as the head of this Congress, it seemed like a little bit of an opportunity to me for the United States to kind of give up this regime change effort, at least relax the sanctions regime and allow the Venezuelan people a breath. But that doesn't seem to be the plan going forward. An interesting part to this story, the U.S. claims they need to sanction these planes because they have been harassing American military flights. My biggest question would be, where were the American military flights? Possibly, they're either in or very close to Venezuelan territory, which then it seems like, the U.S. spy planes or what military planes would be harassing the Venezuelan planes. I haven't seen any, video evidence. If you notice occasionally, if a Russian ship or a Russian fighter plane comes too close to a U.S. plane, the military will actually release that, often on Twitter, a video of that. And so I haven't seen that with these planes. Also, they're owned by the Venezuelan state oil company. It seems unlikely to me that they would be any kind of military craft and, civilian or industrial. And I'm not sure they would have the, aviation abilities to harass too many American military planes. Maybe some bigger spy planes or something. I could also see it being somewhat problematic for the Venezuelan state oil company trying to do business. Look at governments in kind of the region that are friendly towards the United States, Colombia, Brazil, the new government, the Coup government in Bolivia, could potentially continue with these sanctions, and it would make it harder for the, board members, executives, or whoever of the Venezuelan oil company to travel abroad. Part of the U.S. regime change effort in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela, but it's also about Cuba. Now, when the Trump administration came into effect, the policy towards Cuba had really changed under Obama. A lot of people focus on how Trump undid Obama's diplomatic victories in Iran, and I've certainly talked about that a lot on the show, and it's absolutely accurate and important to point that out. But it's also happened in Cuba, which has gotten far less attention. So Obama opened up U.S. relationship with Cuba, allowed American travel to Cuba, American cruise ships were going to Cuba, and Trump came into office, and apparently some employees at the State Department were getting sick from what they claimed were, I guess, the Cuban government or somebody in Cuba using noise weapons against the U.S. State Department employees. It turns out that the noise, I believe, was crickets, so there's a lot of questions if there were sound weapons ever used. I mean, it's possible that, maybe they were even collateral. The Cuban government somewhat impressive. Maybe they're using them against the people. All the same, that was an excuse by the Trump administration to to withdraw U.S. staff and then expel Cuban staff. This eventually, though, kind of morphed into the Cuban government was flaunting the U.S. efforts of regime change in Venezuela by supporting the Maduro government. So now we have to punish the Cuban government, the Cuban people for that by sanctioning the Cubans as well. One of the major things that has changed is the U.S. is no longer allowing cruise ships to go to Cuba, and this has been happening for several months, but is continuing to cut flights to Cuba and now including charter flights. I'm sure one of the problematic things is, just to get down to on a small level, there's a lot of Cubans living in the United States with families still in Cuba. Something's going on in your family, nephew's getting married, uncle passes away, maybe closer relatives, brothers, mothers, dads, or whatever still live there. You want to go back and visit them. I'm sure it's far more restrictive now. So that in itself is a tragedy. But looking at it on a broader scale, it's really, caused a boom in the bust in the Cuban tourism industry. you had thousands of people flooding in. It creates an economy of scale where, maybe new hotels could open, new towns kind of start to become more tourist centers. And, Cuba, who has a communist and restrictive country, but at the same time, I think there are some businesses and stuff like that. To the extent that people are able to start either black market or get the right permits to start a restaurant or something like that and capitalize on this tourism boom, are going to now feel a bust as this comes crashing down and tourism plummets, probably back to where it was during Obama or lower. And it's probably just really unfit and psychologically really, harmful to the Cuban people. And, let's say a Democrat comes into office in a couple of years and, it gets to 2022 and unfortunately President Joe Biden or President Warren is sitting in office and decides that, well, we, kind of want to open up relationships with Cuba again. Well, do you think people in Cuba are going to be like, oh yeah, we, should open up this tourism industry again? Or are they going to maybe see it as a ploy or a possible trap where they go, they invest, they make efforts, they, spend time and money, trying to build something and it's all collapsed based on the whims of the U.S. president. I want to talk about Glenn Greenwald here, who is now, I believe, facing hacking charges from the Brazilian government. I'm not sure if this is substantiated enough of a claim in how the Brazilian court system works to actually mean that he's like going to be arrested and put in jail or at the very least, detained, processed, and charged. But they're claiming he was involved in hacking of documents that he published as the editor of The Intercept Brazil. These documents expose corruption in the Brazilian government. As far as I could tell, it was important journalism, and not that I understand all the intricacies of Brazil. I do know that Glenn Greenwald, husband, partner, I'm not sure what, they use. Anyways, is a member of the opposition party in Brazil and what effect that has. But it does seem that Glenn Greenwald, as, a journalist working as the editor of Intercept Brazil, was able to publish very important documents about corruption in Brazil. And it seems like the claims against him are likely made up, but that is at this point just from the kind of perspective of Glenn Greenwald that I've read this. My sense is that, good, expose corruption, get the word out there, and Glenn Greenwald should not be facing persecution. I would guess he has some kind of foreign passport, so maybe he could not end up in a Brazilian jail, which sounds like a pretty horrific place. There's also the fact that the Brazilian government is pretty far right-wing and culturally right-wing at this point. And so there is some indication that, Glenn Greenwald and his, partner could be the target of the Brazilian government for more reasons than just his reporting. Whenever I talk about Glenn Greenwald or a whistleblower, I like to talk about them all, especially those who are suffering. Chelsea Manning continues to rot in an American prison, even though she served her time and got her clemency from Obama, was released from prison. They've locked her back up for refusing to testify against Julian Assange, who's currently locked up in a UK prison waiting an extradition case against the US. He has as well served his time in the bail, punishment that he was actually prescribed. But at this point, there's no other reason to hold him other than they say, well, he's waiting extradition and we're going to hold him. I am pretty concerned now that Julian Assange may not even make it to see a trial in the U.S. They say his health is deteriorating. When I first heard this, I thought there's no way they let this guy die. See him as maybe being some kind of martyr who bravely stood up to the world empire, the U.S. empire, and was just persecuted beyond belief until they finally treated him so poorly in the dungeon of a UK prison that he died, and they wouldn't let that happen. They would make sure he gets medical care, and they, could at least extradite him to the U.S. and let him face charges here. It doesn't seem like anybody in the UK is in any hurry to give Julian Assange any sense of justice, whether that's receiving appropriate medical care or just having access to his lawyers so he could prepare a defense. The U.S. is continuing to put out statements saying that they hope China, abides by or starts joining into arms control negotiations with Russia. This is a poison pill to make sure no arms control gets done with Russia. China does not have the same nuclear arsenal as the United States or Russia. Well over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons are either Russian or American. And so China makes the point, and this is a pretty important one to make, is why would we agree with an arms control when you have so much more than us? And so the U.S. needs to stop focusing on arms control with China right now and build some arms control agreements with Russia. And once the U.S. and Russia negotiate down some more of their nuclear weapons, then they could start including other countries, China, and that could even bring India and Pakistan into some kind of denuclearization, or at least a step down. Everybody could have far fewer nuclear weapons. It seems like everything the U.S. does, whether that's the goal or not, increases nuclear proliferation rather than reduce it. That's certainly the case with the North Korea policy, where Trump led Kim's New Year's deadline expired without even trying to engage in negotiations, has blown this awesome opportunity that he had of the situation with the Olympics and Moon Jae-in to really move the ball forward with North Korea. That absolutely failed. If you didn't catch it, me and Will Porter did an episode of the show recently in depth on kind of Trump's policy towards North Korea and why it's been a failure if you want more. But now they say they're ending their moratorium on, tests of its nuclear program, and that they could be looking for a new way forward. I think at least trying to make the threat that they may look towards testing some kind of nuclear weapon. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about on today's show is apparently Trump wants to expand his travel ban. This initially happened right when I started the show, and I will say, if you go back and listen to the first few episodes of the show, something that I definitely didn't get right was the travel ban. I thought the Democrats would be far more effective in combating it than they actually were, and it turns out that Trump's travel ban is still in effect with 6 countries on it. Initially, there were 7. Sudan was taken off, but it looks like if the new reported proposal of the Trump administration is correct, Sudan will be placed back on the travel ban list, along with Belarus, Eritrea, Kyrgyzstan, Myanmar, Nigeria, and Tanzania. Just looking at that list is obviously geographically and ethnically and religiously far more diverse than the initial travel ban, which everybody at the time described as an anti-Muslim or a travel ban of Muslim-majority countries. Looking at Myanmar, the country recently admitted that it carried out war crimes and killings of innocent civilians and burning of the homes of civilians that was late summer of 2017. That was the Buddhist majority military waging that against the Rohingya people, which are a Muslim minority. Although in that report, the panel, I believe that was imported by the International Court required Myanmar to put this panel in place. They put the panel in place, they find this, but they walk back kind of and, won't call it any of the big ethnic cleansing or genocidal campaigns, which it seems to be. They forced well over 700,000 people out of Myanmar, where they are suffering in not prison camps, but refugee camps that I'm sure feel an awful lot like prisons at that time in Bangladesh. People dying by being trampled by elephants, floods, viral diseases, all kinds of just really ugly conditions that these people are suffering in these refugee camps. Nigeria stands out just as being the largest country in Africa, and some recent uptick in jihadist violence in that country. Largely this is blowback from the U.S. war in Libya. So, I think that travel bans are anti-libertarian. It seems to me that I have freedom to associate just as much as anybody else, has a right to property or anything like that. And so I should be able to invite somebody on my property just as much as they should be able to keep somebody off of theirs. And, it seems to me that the travel ban is a wrong, kind of conclusion to come to in a very complex situation where America is the world empire and we've killed people in foreign countries, millions of them over the past decade. And there is a real reason that people have safety concerns and want to keep people out of the country. But at the same time, it's not the correct, philosophical or moral conclusion to reach. So and probably practically as well. When you look at all the great, effects of immigration, not only on the U.S., but also as people take ideas back overseas and hopefully spread the ideas of freedom and liberty to their own country. So anyways, I think that's what I have for the show today. A little bit of a shorter one, but I didn't have a whole lot of news stories. So at least this isn't a couple weeks ago where I'm got too much to talk about on the show because the U.S. is, starting a conflict with Iran. Anyways, I think I have a lot of important stuff on the show. So if you liked it, go ahead and click the share button over at the Libertarian Institute. Check the show out on Twitter. I'm at KYAAALE. Check out the Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, and the Patreon page is /Foreign Policy Focus.